Today on the Pro-Life Podcast, Dr. Ingrid Skop will be using her 30 years of OB experience to answer the hard cases. You're gonna wanna watch this. Grab your coffee. Let's get started. Happy Tuesday, Pro-Life family. It's almost Christmas. It's exciting times. Lots of awkward family conversations, probably around the pro-life issue. So we're here to give you more fuel to have the right answers to all of those questions. Our guest today, Dr. Ingrid Skop. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be
Excited to have you here. The rest of the table, Veronica Arnold-Smither, Education Associate and Dr. President John Seago. It's more fun to say Dr. President.
Thank you.
It's just fun.
Earned it.
Dr. Skop, for the friends listening, watching at home, your background. I mean, I've caught the conversation with the team. I'm setting stuff up over here. I'm hearing expert testimonies and years of service and all these things. So it's just the quick summary for the viewers.
Thanks. I have the best job in the world. I have been an obstetrician gynecologist, board certified for over 30 years. I spent 25 years in private practice in San Antonio. During that time, I have cared for tens of thousands of women. I have delivered over 5,000 babies.
Wow.
So I do. I adore my job. I adore both the baby and the mother and the woman that I'm caring for. So I think that brought me into the pro-life work, just seeing how abortion injures women in so many ways. Recently, I've made somewhat of a shift in my career, but it's a very welcome one. I am now the Senior Fellow and Director of Medical Affairs of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. For those who don't know what that is, it's the research arm of Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America.
All right.
So it gives me the opportunity through interviews, through research, through expert witness testimony at the state and federal level to let people who don't understand this issue learn about it. And I'm able to relay the 25 years of experience into contributing to the conversation.
And that's actually where we met Dr. Skop, is we met her and then quickly recruited you to come to Austin
Right.
to testify. And so you've testified.
You guys were the first ones to give me, I'd been
Awesome.
interested in the topic. I would always read op-eds and go, oh, this is not right. I want to respond to this. But it was 2013 that I was able, almost 10 years ago, that I was able to work with you guys.
You've been down there at least half a dozen times for us, for stuff we're working on in Texas. And to actually get the expert in the room, actually from your personal experience, from your professional background, to address some of the myths that we're seeing, some of the lies that would be, brought up in the Capitol against pro-life legislation. You are always a great ally to have there. So we're so happy to partner with you and great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I've been a fan of Dr. Skop's for that long. That was my first session working as a level 1 intern for Texas Right to Life.
She's been fangirling.
Yeah, Dr. Skop's pretty cool. So I remember meeting you, but there were thousands of people there, and there were so many protests going on. It was a really dramatic session back when they were trying to do the 20-week ban to save babies' lives after the point of feeling pain. And so Dr. Skop testified about at what point do unborn children feel pain. And now here we are, post Roe v. Wade, fighting a whole new kind of strange battle. And that leads me to my first question for you, is to help define the word abortion. Because I think in addition to the previous confusion pre-Roe v. Wade about like whether a baby is a human or not, whether they have rights or not, now people don't even understand what abortion is. They're throwing in all these other things under the umbrella word of abortion. Like, that's not right. Here we have an expert. Please define it for us so then we can talk about everything else.
Yeah, thank you, because I think it'll help us frame the conversation. So an abortion is an action that occurs when a pregnancy is known, when a living unborn human exists in the uterus. And the abortion has the intent, and I think the intent is the really important thing to recognize, the intent of ending that human's life. A failed abortion is where that baby escapes and does not die.
Yikes. Right. So any medical intervention then to save the life of a mother, it probably doesn't include an abortion in the intent of killing a baby.
When you're looking at it from that perspective, and it's rare, but it does happen that there can be complications that can seriously threaten a mother's life. And in that situation, the intervention is separation of the mother and the child. Many times throughout my career, I've never performed an intentional abortion, but there have been times when I've needed to separate a mother and the child. Ectopic pregnancy is an early pregnancy event where the pregnancy is generally in the tube, cannot result in a live birth, but as it continues, it can rupture the tube, which can lead to catastrophic bleeding and maternal death. Later on, we'll probably discuss some specific circumstances, but if it happens and I need to separate that mother and her child, I will do it through a standard obstetric way, induce her labor, rarely perhaps a C-section. But my intent is not the death of the baby, even though that may be predictable. Yeah. You know, it may be a gestational age where I know he can't survive, but my intent is to save her, to protect the mother's life.
Yeah. And in Texas, when we actually defined abortion in our law, we had a lot of help from pro-life doctors like yourself to make sure that we were reflecting that. And at the core part of our law, it says the intent is important. You know, that's critical. There's no accidental abortions in Texas from a legal perspective. Right. You have to intentionally be causing the death of the child. And I think that that's the best place to start, because now when we talk about, well, this may be an unintended consequence of a pro-life law, it's like, well, let's be clear what the purpose of the law is. It's to stop intentionally causing the death of the child. That's what we're aiming for. And these other circumstances, we need to make sure that we're clear on them. But that medical perspective has translated into the law now that we're, here. And but there's a lot of other examples and issues that come up.
Well, even in addition to the intent, which is a very philosophical way of putting things, there's also just the very physical process of abortion versus separation. Can you kind of distinguish, like, physically, those are so different? One is dismemberment,
right,
and one is C-section or induction.
Yeah, so again, these life-threatening conditions generally occur later in pregnancy, with the exception of an ectopic pregnancy and other very rare situations. So generally what we're dealing with is, and currently the age of viability is about 22 weeks gestation out of a 40-week pregnancy. Wow. So just a little over halfway through a pregnancy, we can often save babies. So we've just got wonderful neonatologists and NICUs and just people who can do that. So if in the rare event that something happens, maybe it's severe hypertension that can't be relieved, or a common situation is where the membranes rupture, the amniotic membranes rupture. And this is actually the beginning stage of labor, really, for most of these situations. And also, almost inevitably, it's associated with an infection. So we know in those situations, maybe it's 18, 20 weeks when we don't expect the baby to live, we know in those situations the prognosis for the baby is very poor. Even if the mother stayed pregnant and he was delivered in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, he needs that amniotic fluid to mature his lungs. And so many times, even if the pregnancy continues, he does die after birth. But the risk to the mother is quite high, because probably there's already a subclinical infection, which can lead to sepsis, overwhelming blood infection, and women have died in that situation. So again, we see that situation, and I think there's been a lot of confusion in Texas, honestly, about this particular situation. But when that is diagnosed, of course, the very first thing we do is have a conversation with the woman. I mean, a doctor is never going to intervene without explaining it and getting, input from the woman. If the woman is not overtly infected at that point, some moms are willing to take a chance for their life, for their baby's life. So we do sometimes see that situation, but undoubtedly, if the woman says, I'm not willing to take that risk, it is appropriate to deliver at that point.
Right.
Now, my respect for the unborn human's life leads me to offer an induction. The D&E abortion procedure, known as dilation and evacuation, or the layman's term is dismemberment, which describes what happens, is a medical alternative. Again, I wouldn't offer it, but the law allows the doctor, if that's something they feel more comfortable with, or they feel this is a more appropriate way to deal with the situation. The law does allow that. But again, an induction can be performed. The woman has a child to hold,
and to
grieve, to photograph. I mean, to me, it's just a much more caring, compassionate way to respect the child's life in addition to the mother's life. But the law allows either.
So in this case, you had a life-threatening medical condition to the woman.
Exactly.
And so the doctor is making his medical judgment in this circumstance that if untreated, if there's no intervention, that this will lead to threatening her life or threatening a major bodily function. Our law gives those two categories. And so then a doctor is making the decision of what intervention do we do? And you were saying, you know, abortion is not, a D&E is not, you know, is that the standard practice, or how would you describe it between those? Because you kind of gave us, there's two routes you could go to. How would you describe it? Because, you know, you're obviously saying you're not comfortable doing the D&E, but some do.
To be perfectly honest, I think most obstetricians would choose the induction. And the reason for that, even though abortion is framed as a, you know, discussion between a woman and her doctor, the reality is very few obstetricians will perform an elective abortion. When polled, somewhere between 7 and 14% say they would, which means that 86 to 93% of OBGYNs, even if they identify as pro-choice, they don't want to do that action. They don't want to actively kill one of their patients. So a D&E has the potential to be a very dangerous procedure. I mean, you can imagine the description. The dismemberment is multiple blind passages in many cases to dismember a baby who's a larger baby. The uterus is distended. It can easily be perforated or ruptured, bleeding. So I won't go into all those details. I'm sure, you know, if people are interested, they can find information about it. But so most doctors don't have the experience with doing a D&E. And so most will probably elect to induce. But as you mentioned, the Texas law actually, I think, is very well written. It says that a doctor can use their reasonable medical judgment to make this decision. And reasonable medical judgment is the same criteria that we practice with every day when we hope to avoid medical malpractice litigation. I mean, an obstetrician, no matter what, goes to work every day, and there's always the possibility that something goes wrong. Somebody second guesses their judgment, and they can question that legally. So nothing really has changed for obstetricians about how they practice. If in their reasonable medical judgment, the woman needs to be delivered, the law allows them to deliver. So
in that judgment, what restrictions do doctor have? Because we're seeing a lot of reports. They pop up in Dallas Morning News. They pop up in other publications where doctors are saying to the media, you know, my hands were tied. There was a woman who had a very dangerous medical condition. Sepsis is, you know, just being discussed a lot, or the potential for sepsis. And, you know, they're saying the law doesn't allow me to make, you know, the best call medically for the health of the woman.
And the government is backing that up. I mean, the White House press secretary, Jean-Pierre, I forget her last name, recently even said that, you know, doctors are not allowed to care for women in these situations, and that's wrong. And it's a lie. So the doctors are being lied to. So how does that, I mean, what restrictions are there that would lead a doctor to think they don't have those options?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to consider with this problem. Number one is that the vast majority of abortions in our country are elective. They're done for reasons of social or financial distress. I mean, certainly these women are in distress. I agree. But we can do better than to offer the killing of a human being to deal with those difficult situations. Absolutely. And I'm sure you guys have discussed this at length.
It just doesn't seem unreasonable. It just doesn't.
But because it's so difficult on the surface to defend elective abortion, abortion advocates have directed their attention to the rare situations. Right. And it is the case that abortion for the life of the mother accounts for far, far less than 1% of all abortions. So they're misdirecting the attention, and then they're miseducating and misinforming the public. As I said, the Texas law, I think, is very well written. And I think even if my colleagues read the law, they would possibly be practicing in a different way than they currently are. They're not reading the law. They're reading the newspapers.
Yeah.
And the newspapers are telling them they can't intervene. And so it's become sort of a vicious cycle.
Well, one of the things, not just the newspapers, I mean, the New England Journal of Medicine, had a kind of perspective piece, an opinion piece out right after Roe v. Wade was overturned, talking about the Heartbeat Act and what was happening in Texas between the Texas Heartbeat Act and Roe v. Wade being overturned. And the way that they categorized our law, or they characterized our law, was saying that a woman had to be on death's door for a doctor to be able to intervene in early induction, or like you were saying. So how did we get there where
it's a lie and it's
even
fear-mongering.
Even the journal, I mean, is saying you have to be on death's door, whereas clearly there's no immediacy.
Yeah. So just to back that up and to disprove that point, an attorney and I at Charlotte Lozier looked at all the state laws, not just Texas, but all the laws that restrict abortion that have been passed in the wake of the Dobbs decision. None of them prohibits an intervention to save the woman's life, and none of them require immediacy. So the word immediate or imminent is not in the legislation, but yet you hear that how do we know? How long do we have to wait? Does she need to be, circling? And you never want to wait that long in medicine because you don't know if you can save her, right? If she becomes that sick. There was an article, unfortunately published here in Texas by doctors at Southwestern, which is a very prestigious medical school. And they write the textbook that I learned from. I was very sad to see that they did this, but they took it upon themselves, apparently without any legal guidance, to interpret the Texas law, as you said, that it required them to wait until the woman was in imminent risk of death. And the PPROM situation that I mentioned earlier, the ruptured membranes, they did not offer those women delivery, even though it has always been the standard of care. And they even remarked in their peer-reviewed journal article, it's the standard of care, but we can't do it because Texas won't let us. And documented that over half of those women had fortunately, no one died. One woman did get a hysterectomy, but over half of them had severe morbidity, that they went to an ICU, that they had a blood transfusion, surgery. I mean, as predicted, they did poorly.
Yeah.
And it made me very sad to see that. One last statement to make. Unfortunately, although probably your listeners would not be surprised to understand that medicine and most of the mainstream medical organizations have taken I'm not even going to say pro-choice, I'm going to say a pro-abortion ideology. And it's not because there's anything in the medical literature that proves that abortion is helpful for a woman's physical or mental health. There is no documentation of that anywhere. But they've taken this ideology, and really it backs up to even prior to Roe, when the leadership of many of the medical organizations was intertwined with the leadership of the American Eugenics Society. And there has long been a eugenics motivation behind this. And of course, now we see a lot of women who are doing poorly in poor social situations. And again, offering them this option and no other option is a very poor choice. But it's important to recognize that that's the case for many of them.
Right.
And that's why you get articles like, I mean, we've seen them all across the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal, formally prestigious journals that are going out on a limb and advocating for abortion for social engineering, not medical reasons.
Oh my goodness. Well, and to add to the fear mongering, we recently saw an article come out that said that they were encouraging doctors to break the law as if it was illegal to intervene in these medical emergencies. So that's wrong. It's not illegal to intervene in a medical emergency. And also, breaking the law. They're literally encouraging physicians to break a law that doesn't exist. It's absolutely absurd and leads to so much confusion and chaos. I have a friend who is an OBGYN, just finished all of her education, recently opened her practice this year, days before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And then about a month later, ABOG came out with this letter of intimidation about misinformation and disinformation, and she's super pro-life, and so she was crushed. She feels like, I feel like I have to keep my head down because they're going to come after me. They're adding to the fear-mongering. They're not interpreting the law and explaining it to people, saying like, actually, you can still get all the care you need. They're just telling physicians to be quiet. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you saw that letter by ABOG. Can you explain to the listeners about that?
And the intent, I believe, I'm not sure that it's legal for them to threaten what they threaten.
It shouldn't
be.
But
the intent is to keep people like your friend who are new to keep their heads down. So the backing up, the story behind this actually goes back even further. Last September, ABOG, this is the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, who allow us to have our board certification and have the ability to withdraw it. And just so you know how important it is to have board certification, you lose your board certification, you lose your hospital privileges. You lose your hospital privileges, you lose your job. So this is quite a serious threat.
Yeah.
Last September, they came out with a letter threatening to take away board certification for COVID misinformation. Because, of course, there were a lot of doctors who were, there's a lot of different ways to look at COVID. And there were, it was decided at that time that only the CDC's way was the appropriate way, which is, medicine, science needs dissent. This is how we move forward and come up with newer and better ways to do things. But nonetheless,
guys, let me know if the COVID disclaimer appears below the abortion
I'm sure
disclaimer.
It will. We got an abortion disclaimer.
Now we're going to be taken
double
off
flag
YouTube. But
it's been a good run.
But I had the privilege last September to give expert witness testimony to the U.S. House Oversight Committee. I was the only pro-life
that's fun, isn't
there.
it?
So that was. You thought Texas? You guys prepared me for jumping into the fire there, but the abortionist who was a witness looked at me and told me that. She said, "Dr. Skop, are you aware that ABOG can take your board certification for misinformation?" So I saw already where this was going, and you're right. In July, they expanded that letter to say not only COVID misinformation, but any misinformation regarding reproductive health, which we know is the code word for abortion. So when that happened, the pro-life organizations did not sit still. They recognized the threat, immediately reached out with the assistance of our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom and said, no, you cannot do this. And so they have taken a step back. As far as I know, no one has been targeted with that threat.
That's good. I hadn't heard.
But it was. But it is. But the end point, I think, is not to get people like me, because I'm not going to stop talking about it. But it's to get people like you, your friend, not to begin to engage.
Right. It's people new in their career, afraid of losing everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like you're more cancel proof now. You've been doing this for so long.
They tried,
and now you literally your main focus is education about this. So if they tried to cancel you, it's a little too late for that. So anyway, that's awesome. Well, and there's another article that you mentioned earlier about the 28 women who it was advertised in Slate about these 28 women who basically doctors felt like their hands were tied. They couldn't do anything to help these women. And I love the way you put it earlier before we turned the cameras on. You said they were bragging about their malpractice. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, before we get to that, we got to take a quick break, y'all. We will come back and then we'll discuss how they were bragging about their malpractice.
Oh my goodness. Book your tickets today for Boots on the Ground Pro-Life Convention. Join us in January 28th and 29th in Austin, Texas for an amazing lineup of pro-life speakers. We have Father Frank Pavone of Priests for Life, Destiny of New Wave Feminists, expert apologist Trent Horn, and so many more. We will gather with hundreds of people to march to the Texas Capitol to celebrate the end of Roe v. Wade and to learn our legislative agenda for keeping Texas pro-life forever. BootsOnTheGroundTX.com. See you in January.
Without warning, you or your loved one could end up in the emergency room where every second counts and your medical wishes matter more than ever. However, if your loved one doesn't have the right medical documents on hand, they may not be able to make decisions for you in a crisis. My Life Angels solves all of this by walking you through step-by-step in creating these important medical documents and storing them online securely for you and your family to access at any time. The service is only $7 a month, but use the link in our description for 20% off your initial subscription period. Don't let strangers make life and death decisions for you. Get the My Life Angels app today.
Welcome back, friends. So I have refilled my coffee. We took a break. So we left with 28 cases of bragging on your medical malpractice, which sounds like a brilliant and ridiculous headline.
Here to explain.
Yes,
Dr.
but here to
Skop.
explain. Yes.
Yeah, this specific article, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but it was 28 women at Southwestern in Dallas, but 26 of them were preterm premature rupture of membranes, the situation that I mentioned that can be very dangerous from an infection standpoint. And, you know, I'm not going to postulate why the physicians made the decision they did not to offer the standard of care, but I would like to say that I think a lot of what is going on in Texas, I'm still practicing, and I've had these discussions with some of my colleagues, but I think it's happening around the country as well, is that doctors, most of the time they're not attorneys. They don't really trust themselves to know for sure what the law says. Mm-hmm. The law does threaten them with a felony if they break the law. So that's serious. I mean, doctors are busy. We go to work. We see 30 patients. We deliver 15 babies a month. We want to go home, relax with our family, and not worry that in addition to medical malpractice, that somebody's going to try to hit us with a felony. So I understand the hesitancy of the physicians. I think where the problem lies is, again, I mentioned that many of the mainstream medical organizations do have a pro-choice bias, and they have remained silent.
Yeah.
I have seen very, very few guidance or recommendations from any of the medical organizations. Belatedly, I am seeing that many of the hospital systems are starting to give guidelines. But again,
finally,
here in Texas, we've had laws restricting abortion for almost a year and a half. Yeah. You know, so it really took, and so again, I'm not going to postulate why that happened, but I do know that ideologically, they would like the laws to fail. Mm-hmm. And so that has happened. My professional organization, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, it's hard to describe, but there's essentially two components of this organization. There's a component that is very, looks at the peer-reviewed literature, gives us recommendations, and is very helpful for the physicians on the ground. This is essentially the standard of care, what ACOG tells us. Mm-hmm. And when I say that it is the standard of care to offer delivery in the situation of those 28 women, that's because ACOG told me it is. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we have very good guidance, but on the other hand, we have the leadership of an organization that has never actually asked me in the 25 years I've been a member, how do you feel about our abortion advocacy? Mm. They just assume that we all agree and they run with it. And that's where we're seeing that abortion is critical, medical care and all of these things that are not backed up with medical facts that are ideological.
And in Texas, that's what we see every session. We pass legislation that affects the practice of medicine, whether it's abortion or other topics. Mm-hmm. And then you have these other organizations that kind of connect the dots between the law and the practitioners. And that has been the breakdown that we've seen in the last year is these typical medical associations, that do advocate for legislation. We know where they are ideologically, but still after a session, they feel like it's their responsibility to pass practical guidelines, practical recommendations for the practitioners. We don't expect doctors to take a break from their patients to go, read our law and, dig into all the definitions of law. But those kind of, that chain, those connections that help the practitioners know what the law is, that's the breakdown that we've seen. Yeah. And I've heard from elected officials who are absolutely, frustrated with this because they said, why is it not working now when it has worked for decades where we pass laws?
The media.
Maybe people don't like the laws that they pass. We've passed some controversial patients' rights laws back in 17 and in 15. And even those medical associations that didn't like that law, they still released reports and memos and guidelines of what the doctors are supposed to do, but we don't have that.
Yeah, it is their responsibility. You're right. And we're just in a whole new world where the gloves are off, right, on abortion. It has become so politicized and people have such strong feelings that these organizations, because of their silence, are allowing very poor patient care to occur, particularly in Texas.
Well,
and I've seen it, and it's very distressing.
Part of me wants to say, the super ideologically minded pro-abortion advocates would be thrilled to have a case of a woman who was quote unquote denied access, died because of it, and now they can use her as a poster child to get abortion back. And I'm like, that, I honestly feel like some people are waiting for that to happen. And that is horrible because two thoughts. We need to talk about standard of care. What is the standard of care? And the other thing is so many pro-choice advocates, while Roe was still the law of the land, would say that pro-lifers didn't care about the mother. But now I feel like the tables have clearly turned. The pro-choice advocates are the ones who are not caring about intervening to save the mother. They don't care about the standard of care anymore, or they've been lied to and told that they can't. Yeah. So what is the standard of care? What would you have done for these 28 women? Or maybe you don't know about those exact specific cases, but I mean, you have 30 years of experience of other stories. So what would you have done? As a doctor?
Yeah, I mean, what you said is exactly right, in that if a woman does die because of this failure to intervene, it will be a big deal. And I'd personally like to see the state government ask the state board of medical examiners to do their job. You know, I think that there could be, some pressure from that perspective. Ireland, a woman died in this exact situation, and her specific case was used to overturn the abortion law.
And it was such a flawed response to her death. And it was a tragic death. It should never have happened. But the way they changed the law based on her tragic death was horrible. We don't want that to
having read
here.
about her specific case, it was clearly medical malpractice.
Yes.
She was very much infected and they refused to intervene. But going to what we should expect and I think we've all seen the articles of women being denied, for example, miscarriage care. So the Texas miscarriage, the definition of a miscarriage is that the embryo or fetus has passed away. This is no longer a living pregnancy. Laws to protect life in utero don't apply. And specifically, almost every law specifically says this does not apply to a miscarriage. So it's there. If you can read 5th grade level, you can read the law and know that if there's a miscarriage. I hope
my doctor is past the 5th grade.
But I've seen women not being offered a D&C for a miscarriage.
Disgusting.
Ectopic pregnancy, I mentioned earlier. A pregnancy that is not implanted in the uterus does not have the ability to reach viability. And these are heartbreaking because most of the time these are mothers who are devastated to discover that they have a living child, but it's inevitably doomed to die. And again, in the process, if it's allowed to continue, it can threaten the mother's life through catastrophic hemorrhage. So every Catholic OBGYN, every pro-life OBGYN will intervene in that situation. So again, these are situations that it's obligated to protect the mother's life. And as a doctor, every doctor will do do that. So again,
how do you actually intervene?
It can be done several ways. It can be done surgically. A laparoscopy, the surgery through the belly button. The tube can be opened surgically, and the pregnancy tissue can be removed, or the tube can be taken, and different situations or patient preference, or can help to make that decision. It can be removed with a medication called methotrexate. That's an injection that just helps the pregnancy tissue to dissolve and stop growing. So all of those things are appropriate. Again, nothing is prohibited by Texas law. And in fact, again, Texas law says this does not, an exception is an ectopic pregnancy. We mentioned the PPROM, and I think when you see the articles where they're like, we couldn't intervene in a miscarriage, what they're saying is these are, I would call this a incomplete miscarriage. Like an active
So we know,
again, the active labor has already started. The bag of water has broken. The pregnancy is inevitably going to be lost. And so, they say, well, we're not allowed to intervene in that situation. But again, I made the argument earlier, this can be threatening to the mother. And we don't know if it's going to lead to sepsis or not, but we know it could. So we do have, we can intervene in that situation.
So in Texas law, there's kind of two routes. It's, okay, and then we see these stories of, we were, the child was, or the mother was miscarrying. It was, in the process of the child passing away, but the child's still alive. So they were saying it's not a miscarriage under Texas law, but you're saying there's a whole nother route for the doctor saying, well, now this is a condition that's threatening the life of the mother. So you could go either way. So the law allows that flexibility, but they're using the fact that, okay, it's not yet, a miscarriage has not yet occurred. The child is still alive.
Right. Actually.
And they're using that to say, Texas law doesn't allow doctors to intervene. Whereas your point is, no, we have enough language on the other side of medical emergencies to treat the woman, make sure that she's safe.
We actually have a call that happened just about a week ago to our office with this right in this gray area. Sorry to interrupt. I got all excited, but it's a tragic phone call. We get a lot of phone calls from people in various healthcare crises, whether they feel like they're not being heard by their doctor or maybe they just want help understanding their doctor or something like that. And it's usually about more end of life stuff or like brain injury, things like that. But this one was about a woman who was having a miscarriage. She was about 22 weeks and she was in a rural hospital in Texas, and the doctors said that they couldn't do anything, and they rolled in an abortion machine in the hallway and left it there, and were waiting for her to be more serious before they would do anything. And so her loved ones were calling the Texas Right to Life office saying, what do we do? What do we do? And it was terrifying. And so the fact that this is really happening. So like, what would you have done for this woman instead of rolling down an abortion machine and waiting in the hallway until her situation is more serious?
The reality is, anytime a life-threatening condition happens, no doctor, even the most pro-choice doctor, does not walk into the woman's room. Because again, remember, these are usually very much desired pregnancies.
Right.
No doctor walks in and says, you need an abortion. I mean, that's just, no doctor's that uncaring, honestly. If in the first trimester, if a miscarriage is threatened, it doesn't take long with bleeding occurring for the baby to die because he's got a relatively small placental attachment. There's just not that much there. So I think we're talking in these situations about second trimester, again, the PPROM that I mentioned, but the other
what is
scenario,
PPROM again?
The premature pre-viable rupture of membranes, so the very early rupture of membranes. I believe there's a Hollywood actress, you might know her name.
Chrissy Teigen.
Chrissy Teigen.
Well, she's a model or something like that.
That had a similar
legend or whatever. Yeah.
That had a similar situation where she was bleeding and the placenta was separating. It was getting to the point that it was a threat to her life, the amount of bleeding that she was having. The baby had not yet died. So again, that's a situation, life of the mother. If she's, if this could inevitably lead to sepsis that could kill the mother, if this could inevitably lead to a hemorrhage that could kill the mother, when we see, many times with those abruptions, we'll put them at bed rest and we'll watch and see because sometimes they stop bleeding.
Yeah, but you don't stand back and say, I'm so sorry, we can't do anything.
Once we reach the point where we realize this pregnancy cannot be saved, for the life of the mother, we can intervene.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened in that situation, but that sounds horribly
I think what they were saying, what
to
the
just
loved
have
ones
a
were
machine
saying,
sitting in the hall.
What the loved ones are saying was basically that, they were offering her a dismemberment abortion. But what I've heard so many pro-life doctors like yourself say is that we would just simply induce labor. And it's tragic situation all around, but we're not dismembering the child. So, is that right? You induce labor and you give the parents an opportunity to mourn and hold their child and say goodbye properly instead of rolling in a vacuum machine.
Yeah. And part of the healthy physician-patient relationship is this back and forth. These are the options. Here's the physician. These are the options. This is the situation. These are the options we have. Let me hear what obviously, if it's an extreme emergency, maybe you don't have a lot of time for that conversation, but surely they had time for that conversation. And I can't really think of a reason that she would have had to have a dismemberment abortion.
Exactly.
And couldn't have been induced in that scenario. So, there's just so much misinformation. But going back to Chrissy Teigen, how sad for her that she's now on social media saying, I had to have an abortion, promoting, again, 98% of these are elective, healthy moms, healthy babies.
Right.
And promoting that narrative when she had a tragic obstetric complication that cost her baby.
Yeah.
And we all have sympathy for that.
Yeah.
And her doctor did everything they could to save the baby. It just didn't work, unfortunately. And so they induced labor. She got to mourn her baby. 2 years later, she's saying it was abortion. I'm like, well, how do you define abortion? Like, are you talking about dismemberment abortion? Because clearly that's not that's not what happened to you.
Yeah, I think it just goes to just the misinformation. So many, this is why this discussion is important. So many people don't understand the topic. And it's understandable because unless they're like us and they're really, really interested,
Right.
it's a difficult topic to think about. So a lot of people would prefer not to address it, but then they don't know how to interpret what they're being told by the media about how these laws are hurting women when they're not hurting women.
Yeah. No,
it's
great.
the ignorance of the laws that's
Right.
hurting women.
That's helpful. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that it seems like the younger doctors coming into this are being bullied and get fed a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
If we could take just a couple minutes, what worldview from your years of experience and active practice would you like to impart to these new ones coming into the field, those considering heading into the field, to counterbalance the misinformation they're probably being fed?
I'm optimistic. I think there's much reason to expect that things are going to get better as information comes out. I think everyone's aware there's been, particularly with social media, there's been sort of a dearth of misinformation. And so a lot of people, these Gen Zers who supposedly all voted for abortion in the last election, they've not ever seen an alternate viewpoint, but they don't need abortion to be successful. Women are very successful today, and women like yourself are successful and have multiple children and embrace both motherhood and work or, a career. So I think that as information trickles out to people who think that pro-choice is the sympathetic and the necessary and the feminist position that must be embraced, I think there's a very good chance that people are going to start changing their perspectives as these conversations can be have. This young generation is a generation that's very much interested in human rights. Well, who's the most vulnerable to human beings on the planet today? As far as obstetrics goes, I like to think that I and really most obstetricians that I know have what we call a two-patient paradigm. We have the privilege of caring for two patients at once, the mother and her unborn child. And we do have to balance their needs. And as we've discussed today, there are occasions where the needs of one are at odds with the needs of the other. But the vast majority of the time, the needs of both can be accommodated and they can make it healthily through a pregnancy. I mentioned ABOG and some of the pro-choice medical organizations. I would say that they have, and this is not a reasonable position, a one-patient paradigm. The pregnant woman is their patient. The fetus only matters if the pregnant woman says he does. And this is not based on science. Science tells us that is a living human being. And so I think that my middle son is a first-year medical student. I'm very proud of him. I'm very proud of the young people who are entering medicine today, particularly the field of OBGYN, who do it because they love that patient and those patients, that they want to care for both. So I'm hopeful that as we begin to have these conversations and people can look at the nuances and recognize the humanity of the fetus, that perhaps we will begin to see medicine shift back into a two-patient paradigm for the mother and her child.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Skop, thank you so much for your work here in Texas, your help for us, helping us educate. And I know with Lozier Institute and all the different hats that you wear, you're out there promoting the truth about pro-life laws and about the good practice of medicine. This legislative session in January, we're going to be back in the Capitol, and these questions are going to come up. There's a lot of legislators that are misinformed, just like, some of the audience and some of the media that we've been talking about. There's going to be bills to try to undo our pro-life wins. There's going to be politicians trying to utilize these topics to say we need to repeal the right to life for unborn children. And so, in January here in Texas, like all the other states that you're helping, we're going to, continue to protect life. We're going to continue to, if necessary, adopt some of these tools we've been talking about for clarity for our practitioners, for our good doctors who are confused about this. And so thank you so much for your assistance. Thank you so much for your clarity here. The Texas legislature does start in January. We will be there promoting how do we stop abortion, We've seen a lot of lawlessness we've talked about on the show several times.
Yes.
There are several things we can do to promote life, to actually build a pro-life Texas. And then, of course, we still have patients' rights. We have a lot of medical ethics legislation that we need to do to protect life in hospitals. So got a lot of work. We also have our next big event is the Boots on the Ground convention in Austin coming up in January. We'd love to have you guys there. We'll be talking about this and other topics. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Skop. It's awesome to have you here.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I would say to your viewers, as much as you're working hard in the area of law, the issue of abortion is not going to change until we win hearts and minds to recognize the humanity of the fetus and how it harms women. So for more information, Charlotte Lozier, our website is lozierInstitute.org. Additionally, the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, AAPLOG.com, have a lot of information about these medical issues. So, you know, if your listeners can educate themselves and then be able to tell their friends. And I think that's the way we're going to win hearts and minds.
Absolutely.
And we will drop all those links in the description. And thank you, friends, for watching. We love you. Share this with your friends. You have useful information now to deal from an expert. You don't get much more expert than this to answer those hard cases, those hard questions. So share this with your friends and family. We love you guys. Merry Christmas. We're going on break. We'll see you in 2023. Oh my gosh.